Welcome to the first edition of the Nahar Jito Bookathon presented in association with the Raisoni Foundation. In this session, we shall be exploring the book Asylum, The Battle for Mental Health Care in India. Daman Singh delves into the historical evolution of mental health care in India, tracing its journey from mystery to scientific understanding, highlighting pivotal reforms during British rule and the subsequent impact of political upheavals like world wars and partition. Singh explores the transition from forced confinement to dignity and rights for the mentally ill. This narrative unravels the roles of key figures and the transformation brought by Indian doctors and administrators in managing mental health institutions, offering a compelling exploration of a century long struggle for better care and acceptance. A speaker for this session, Daman Singh, graduated in mathematics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi in 1984. She went to the Institute of Rural Management for further studies and worked in the field of development for 20 years. She is the author of two previous works of non-fiction, The Last Frontier, People and Forests in Mizoram, 1996, and Strictly Personal, 2014. A memoir of her parents Manmohan Singh and Gurshan Kaur. She has also written three novels, 9 by 9, 2008, The Sacred Grove, 2010, and Kitty's War, 2018. She lives in Delhi with her husband and dog. A moderator for this session, Ms. Shalaka Kulkarni, hails from India's Orange City, Nagpur. Call, calls Bangalore's purple skyline her favorite muse and every window seat her favorite abode. She has been passionate about writing since 8, and her first book, Orenda, stands taller as a milestone, starting her literary journey as an author. She started embracing words by publishing poems in local newspapers, became an editor for college magazines, did multiple poetry and writing challenges, and is now exploring the canvas of spoken word poetry with local and national forums like Your Quote. She is also a core team member of the Kalinga Literary Festival. This sanguine writer is also an artist, TEDx speaker, marketing or branding professional, and has been associated with big brands across the globe like McDonald's, Salesforce, SPE, Hindustan Unilever, VMware, Kantar, Brilio, a Bain Capital company, Terribly Tiny Tales, Unacademy, etc. I would now like to hand over the session to our moderator.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here in conversation with Daman ma'am, and let's kickstart the conversation. So, in while the growing conversation regarding mental health is indeed driving yet a slow yet significant change in our country, Daman Singh's book Asylum: The Battle of Mental Health Care in India covers the history of laws as well as institutional care of mental health that was shaped in India. So, ma'am, firstly, I would like to understand, and my curiosity also, from a personal standpoint, what was the inspiration behind writing the book, Asylum: The Battle of Mental Health Care in India?
Thanks, Shalaka, for being here and talking to me. To come to your question, a few years ago, I had become quite interested in the subject of mental health care as provided by government, as provided by authorities. And when I started reading up on the subject and when I started discussing this with various people, I realized that in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, there was very little understanding of mental illness as an illness. There were a lot of superstitions surrounding this condition. People thought there is some supernatural cause, and it wasn't really seen as a medical issue. And in those days, one of the most prominent measures was to create asylums for the mentally ill, where people affected by this illness would be basically kept until they got better. And if they did not get better, then they would remain, for very long periods of time. Now, somewhere in the 19th century, 1800 and something, the thinking began to change. And particularly in Europe, there was this belief that this is a medical condition and it can be treated. and in many cases, it can also be cured. And therefore, the whole effort for mental health care changed. This change came about very slowly and differently in different countries. And what I was really curious about is that how did this change come about in India? Because till about the year 1900, we too had asylums for the mentally ill, and we too were following practically, the old medieval system that this cannot be treated, this cannot be cured. But around the year 1900, this began to change. And that is what I wanted to write about in some detail in my book. I cannot hear you, Shalaka.
Sorry. So I was saying that it's fantastic, and that would have, required a lot of research. So moving on from this, I would want to understand how was the journey of Asylum like? How did you go about the research and findings? I would want to, know a little more on that front.
Well, I found that actually there were very few books on the subject. In fact, there were no books which talked
Oh,
about the reform part of it. There were several books which
okay.
talked about what asylums were like in the 18th century, in the early 19th century. But there was hardly any published material on what happened after the year 1900. So I really had to search very hard. And I had to go back to primary sources. So I went to the National Archives of India, where they keep all these old government files.
Yeah.
And so, one can go through a file and actually read what different officers said. You can read their memos, you can read their reports. So it's really quite a fascinating thing to be doing. Then
Indeed, indeed.
I also got a lot of information from annual reports of mental hospitals in India.
Mhm.
In the early 20th century, there were about 20 such institutions. So there was
Okay.
quite a lot of material there. And then, of course, there were the writings of people, whether they were, officials or doctors who wrote about the subject. So these were actually my main sources of information.
Okay, and how long did it take? As in, how was the journey like in terms of findings, and then how you went about processing it, and how did it reach the book format?
I think in all, probably spent about 4 years from start to finish. Uh, I think the first 2 years were basically collecting information, and the last two
Hmm.
years I spent mostly on the writing and editing part. So yeah,
Interesting.
about 4 years.
And you spoke about how the British, went about reforming asylums in India, and what was the impact of their interventions? Could you help us understand a little more on that?
Yeah, well, actually, the asylums were a creation of British rule. We did not
Okay.
have such institutions in India before they came. So they created these institutions, and while they started to reform their own institutions back home in England. They introduced better laws, better policies, a better system of administration. However, in India, they did much less.
Okay.
So it was only in the year 1900 that the
Hmm.
British government in India sort of took a policy decision that we have
Hmm.
to reform the asylums in India. And one of the main objectives was that we must have each asylum must be managed by a full-time specialist. So,
Okay.
firstly, it shouldn't be a non-medical person. It has to be a senior doctor, and that doctor must be trained in handling mental diseases, mental illness. So that I
Okay.
think was the most important reform measure that the British introduced.
Okay. So parallelly from the medical side of things, even the medical knowledge or the medical science in terms of psychology or in terms of, mental health parallelly also was elevated. I mean, if we needed more doctors or if we needed more superintendents to, manage these asylums, I think parallelly those reforms are also brought in
Well,
in
to
terms of
some extent,
education. Yeah.
because there was a great shortage of qualified specialists in India at that time.
Hmm.
Um, and in those days, our own medical colleges did not have departments of psychiatry. I think even departments of psychology were extremely limited. So
Hmm.
the shortage of specialists was a big problem. It was a big problem through British rule, and actually, it's a big problem even today. We still have a
Yeah.
shortage of specialists.
Yeah. Understood. And like while we were talking about how the British, brought asylums to India, what were the challenges faced in the pre-independence area? Sorry, pre-independence pre-independence era, and in terms of how did it impact after the British left, and what was the impact? How we went about implementing change?
Well, uh, during the period of British rule, as I said, there were no big changes in laws and there were no big changes in policy. So it was really left to the individuals who were running each asylum to improve them as best as they could. And if you read the reports, if you read the essays and articles by these individuals, they really show what a tough job these doctors had. I mean, they got very little support from government. Other doctors, from outside this specialty really did not appreciate what these doctors were trying to do. The administration was still had these old-fashioned ideas of what is mental illness and, constantly doubting that, look, forget it, one can't really do anything about it, and why put money into these institutions? So they had a really tough time. And they really had to use all their imagination and all their energy went into getting support for their work.
Understood, understood. So, interestingly, you have a chapter entitled Lahore in the book, and could you shed some light on that?
The chapter which is titled Lahore is very different from the chapters before it and the chapters after it. Um, it is basically about the time of partition, basically set in 1947. As we know, when India was partitioned and Pakistan was created, East Pakistan as well as West Pakistan, a large number of people, huge numbers of people from India traveled to Pakistan, basically Muslim people, and huge numbers of Hindu, Sikh, and other communities traveled from Pakistan to India. Now, the governments of Pakistan and the government of India both worked to evacuate these people who wanted to move, who had to move. And this whole operation of evacuation and then subsequent rehabilitation, uh, it took, well, not the rehab part, but the evacuation part took about a year. And then there would be subsequent efforts at rehabilitation. Now, at that point in time, there were a number of mental hospitals in undivided India, which some of those people, their families had gone from India to Pakistan. Some people's families had gone from Pakistan to India. So you had a strange situation where the families may have left, or they may have even been killed, or they were missing. One doesn't really know. But you had the patients who were sort of trapped in these mental hospitals, and their future was extremely uncertain. So, during those 2 or 3 years, what was going on in these particular hospitals? What was happening to these particular patients who were just waiting to be transferred? Uh, we don't know very much about it. The only source of information on this is the mental hospital at Lahore, because in its own reports, it actually documents what was going on. Then there's also some information available on, meetings that were held between Pakistan and Indian authorities on what to do with these people. So it was actually a very, very tragic situation. And eventually, it took 3 years for the two governments to transfer the patients to where they were supposed to go. And the reason why I have included this chapter in my book is that it shows uh, how the government was not prepared to deal with this situation. And while it did manage to deal with, other citizens, it took a really long time to deal with citizens who were mentally ill. And that is something, that sort of situation continued to exist for a very long time, at least in India. I don't know about Pakistan.
Right, right. That's quite an insightful chapter, I believe, because it marks it marks the change from where we were and how things progressed after the independence. I believe that a lot of these reforms would have also revolved around treatment, treating the patients in the asylums, right? And I believe recreation happens to be a very important aspect of cure or mental health overall. So, apart from recreation, could you shed some light on what were the other therapies or treatments which were, prescribed during that time?
Well, till the 1920s and perhaps part of the 1930s, what did the the good mental hospitals try to give to its patients? They believed that patients must get good food, they must get enough rest, they must have uh, forms of recreation, they must have entertainment, they must be kept busy in some sort of meaningful activity, and they must have physical exercise. So these were very general uh, forms of treatment. Then
Okay.
certain additional forms were added on, and those forms of treatment or those therapies were not sort of for the whole population. They were like the doctors would assess a patient and say, okay, this patient needs this particular therapy, and that
Hmm.
patient needs a different therapy. So
Hmm.
various options were tried out. One such option was, say, hydrotherapy. It was
Okay.
believed that if a person lies down with his head up in a tub of warm water for a certain number of hours, that has a sort of healing effect in certain symptoms. So
Okay.
that was one sort of therapy. So there were a number of therapies. Now, the important thing to note is that these therapies were being tried in different parts of the world. We were learning from different countries. And they were all sort of experimental in nature. None of these therapies had been proved that, yes, this will lead to uh, good results. But the
Hmm.
effort was to learn from whatever is happening in the rest of the world and to try out those therapies in India and sort of adapt them for Indian conditions, Indian patients, and hope for the best, basically.
So they were continuously evolving, learning, and
That's
helping
right.
each other out across the globe. And some of these therapies have gained stance in today's practices as well.
Well, a lot of therapies were later on, say around by the 1950s, a lot of these therapies were, you know, analyzed and they were just found completely un, unnecessary and
Unfit.
not at all
Okay.
helpful. So a lot of things were weeded out along the way, but a few things did continue. Uh,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
what really changed things in terms of therapies was that in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of new drugs, new medicines were invented. And these had a more dramatic effect on certain illnesses, not all illnesses. But, you had antidepressants, you had mood stabilizers, uh, antipsychotic medicines. So all these only started coming in the 1950s.
Yeah, that was actually my next question about, medicinal usage. But thank you so much. And, I would also want to understand, like, how are the legal or government protocols defining the mental health situation today in our country?
Um, I would say that for a very long time, this legal and policy matters were uh, deeply, deeply neglected. And in fact, till 1993, we were still following a law which had basically, had been passed in 1858. But we are, I think, extremely fortunate that we now have a new Mental Health Care Act, which was passed in 2017. So it's just a couple of years old. And this law is a complete reversal of what the old law used to be. Under the old law, the patient had no rights. You know,
Okay.
it was all about how to control the how the authority. It was all about the authority's control over the patient. But the new law has sort of turned that upside down. The new law says that every patient is entitled to get proper uh, treatment and care, and the government must provide proper treatment and care. It also says that this patient has the right to determine what sort of treatment he or she is getting. So you can't impose your will on the patient. The patient must be told that, look, this is your problem, this is what it involves, we want to try this kind of treatment, and the patient would then agree or not agree. There would be, in some cases, a patient might be so ill at that point in time where he or she cannot take a decision. Then the law says that a representative of this person can take this decision. So the law also specified that what kind of treatment and care must be provided, not just in mental hospitals, but in general hospitals, in private nursing homes, in private hospitals, any any medical facility that admits a patient. Uh, it said it laid down the guidelines that this is how they should be run. This is how they should care for patients. So this is a very, very revolutionary law for us.
Yeah,
And
and I think it has come at the right time because we are all facing the post effects of the pandemic, right? There are a lot of effects. People are not even aware that they are mentally affected, or even in my case, I was not aware that I was suffering from accumulated stress, and that's when things stumbled, and I realized that and this law will definitely reform a lot of things in India, especially from a corporate standpoint as well, because a lot of organizations are also taking measures to consider mental health as an important companies are defining policies for mental health of their employees, right? So ma'am, one interesting thing I would want to know from you is we come across a new piece of content on mental health every now and then. Social media is filled with some or the other thing about body positivity, or in terms of taking things slow, etc., etc. But how is it helping the situation? Is it really helping overcoming the stigma, fear, shame, etc.? What are your thoughts on this?
I think social media has a really important role to play, simply because so many people have access today to social media, to information, to opinions, to views. And this sort of forum was not available earlier. So, uh, if one wants to spread positive information, if one wants to spread stories about how mental illness can be handled and what it involves, I think social media is a very, very important tool. And you mentioned the word stigma and shame. These things I can understand that in the olden days when we had no clue as to what is mental illness, why does it happen, and we just assume that this is something really ghastly and will ruin one's life, and therefore you didn't tell anybody about it. But those days are gone. Today is very different. Today we know what mental illness is. We know how it affects our bodies. We know how it affects our life, and there are so many therapies that can help people to deal with it. So if social media and other forms help to spread this message, then the days of stigma and the days of shame should really be over.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. On that positive note, I would, also want to take your opinion on how these words of about insanity or mental illness, asylum, how these words have also, you know, in terms of in the olden days, calling anyone insane or using these terminologies was something which was not really okay, and it's still not okay. But how has the society progressed in terms of using these terminologies and embracing the change from a mental health standpoint?
I think what has happened is our ideas have progressed. Uh, our language has not progressed as fast. So while we know now that mental illness is an illness and it's not some supernatural thing, we are
Supernatural.
still using the same words to explain these things. As you said, now nowadays it's considered very wrong and very insensitive to use
Yeah.
the word, say for instance, lunatic. Now in one time,
Yes.
lunatic was just a, well, it meant somebody who has this problem. But today, if you use the word lunatic, it is considered like a gali. You know, there
Right.
used to be a time when somebody who was mentally challenged or had an intellectual disability was called officially called an idiot. Now, if you
Hmm.
use the word idiot, that is virtually a crime. So our
Yeah.
language hasn't changed as fast as our knowledge has, and that's something we all need to work on. And again, I think social media and the mainstream media, because you find that actually mainstream media continues to use fairly insensitive language, both with
Yeah.
respect to mental illness and people who are affected by mental illness.
Yeah, the awareness can definitely happen through social media and other external platforms. And I think awareness is the key. I think, overcoming stigma is the battle half won. Ma'am, would you want to read an excerpt from the book and give our readers a sneak peek before we close?
Sure. I'd love to read a short uh, passage. If I get too long, you can always interrupt me and tell me
No,
that you're
no,
running out of time. That's
no,
okay.
no, that's absolutely all right. This is like a virtual book reading, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, so I'm going to read a bit about one particular mental hospital in British times, and one particular doctor who ran this hospital from about 1920 to 1934. So for 14 years, he was in charge. And this was a hospital in Ranchi, which
Okay.
was only meant for European and Anglo-Indian patients.
Okay.
So I'm going to read now from here.
Sure.
Uh, Given its profile, Ranchi was the best place for an alienist. The word alienist refers to the doctor in charge. It's like psychiatrist. In those days, the word was alienist. Given its profile, Ranchi was the best place for an alienist who wanted to make a difference. Dr. Owen Berkeley Hill, who served here from 1920 to 1934, was a forceful personality, and he was a man of many ideas. Ranchi was the first mental hospital to liberate its patients from curbs in everyday life. Soon after the hospital opened, it put a stop to the use of restraints and seclusion. Um, Restraints were like handcuffs and chains, which earlier days were used. And seclusion refers to the fact that many patients used to be locked up, you know, for either long periods of time during the day. Some people were just locked up permanently. So Dr. Berkeley Hill stopped all this in his hospital. By 1935, the hospital had taken the radical step of removing locks and bolts from the doors of all wards. This meant that patients were never locked in, whether by day or by night. They were free to roam the premises as and when they wished. From 1937, they no longer had to wear the ready-made clothes that were handed out by the hospital. Instead, they could choose the fabric and the design of outfits that would then be tailored to their measurements. If they liked, their clothes could even be brought over from home. A small shop was opened on the campus where patients could buy various things for themselves. In another first, Ranchi did away with the strict segregation of the sexes. While men and women resided in separate sections of the hospital, they came together for common activities during the day. All patients who were fit to work were supposed to attend occupational therapy each morning, but they were offered a large variety of choices and they were free to pick the ones they liked. During their stay at Ranchi, patients remained connected with the outside world. In the early years, dependable patients were allowed to go for walks outside the premises without an escort. By 1925, virtually all patients were eligible for this privilege. Women patients, however, were normally accompanied by an ayah, as patients preferred to patronize the local market. The shop on campus was closed down. Instead, people were free to use the local market. Patients were free to write and receive as many letters as they wished. Most of these letters were not censored, and visitors could drop in to see them during working hours on any day of the week. Once a patient had improved enough to be considered for discharge, he could be sent home for a period of 2 months, and if that went well, he would then be formally discharged. This system had been put in place as early as 1922. When a more vulnerable patient was discharged, the volunteers of an aftercare committee would keep an eye on him and report back to Ranchi. Every 6 months, the hospital sent out a welfare inquiry letter to which former patients and their families would reply. Is there time for another few minutes? Yeah? Dr. Berkeley Hill did not confine his ideas to the institution that he ran. A prolific writer, he contributed to various newspapers and journals. He also addressed a large number of scientific, medical, social, and religious gatherings. One of his concerns was that the medical profession in Britain and in British India did not pay enough attention to the psychological roots of mental disorders. He believed that doctors must have a basic understanding of human psychology. A trained psychoanalyst himself, Dr. Berkeley Hill underlined the benefits of psychotherapy. So he was not all about, you know, drugs and medicine. Um, he also argued the case for psychiatric treatment outside mental hospitals. In his view, an outpatient clinic would enable people to seek treatment at an early stage of illness and for disorders that were relatively less disabling. And apart from building public confidence, these clinics would give psychiatry a place in mainstream medicine. So they were talking about OPDs, but there were no OPDs in those days. Okay, I'll just do another few 30 seconds. Although Rati was privileged and Dr. Berkeley Hill was persuasive, this did not mean that he always got his way. Much to his annoyance, some of his ideas were shot down and others were abandoned after he retired. But very many of them would prevail.
Thank you so much, Daman ma'am.